We started into this sermon series last week on why faith matters, the story of Moses. And I think I explained that I want to do it again, that I started looking at the story of Moses a few months ago, and I thought, wow, this is really a very contemporary story, and that it raises a lot of issues that are relevant for you and me in terms of what it means to make a commitment of faith, what it means to be responsive to God, what it means to go on a spiritual journey, what it means to go deeper in your spiritual journey. So we started talking about that on staff, and we're preaching this series over in Table of Grace, Josh Fitzpatrick. Your children and grandchildren are learning it in Sunday school. I think everybody else is focused this morning on the parting of the Red Sea, maybe. But as I started looking at this week, I was going to do the Red Sea, and I thought, I'm going to stay right here in Midian for a while. Last week, this is one of those sermon series, by the way. If you haven't picked up the first one, it'll just make more sense, I think. So you can get the podcast or the video cast off the website and see that one. So we find Moses on the plain of Midian, and all of a sudden, boom, there's this burning bush, and there's this wonderful moment in which God is present to Moses, and God speaks to Moses. Today, we're going to talk about the response that Moses had to God, because I think it's relevant to the challenges we ourselves face in our own spiritual lives. We'll discover that Moses was thrilled at first, and then Moses had what I call these but God moments. He wasn't too sure that this is something that he wanted to do. So you're not going to get the scripture on the screen this morning, because I'm going to skip around starting in the middle of the 3rd chapter. After Moses has had the burning bush experience and God has told him, I want you to go to Egypt and set my people free, then Moses starts having second thoughts. So we're just going to skip around with a handful of short scriptures. And again, these are what I call Moses' but scriptures, but God. In the 13th verse, for instance, of the 3rd chapter. But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? You can see that Moses is already starting to have cold feet. He's not sure that this is a job or a journey he wants to go on. Then we skip down to the 4th chapter, verse 1. Then Moses answered, but suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, the Lord did not appear to you. Lots of doubts. Then verse 10 of the 4th chapter. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now, that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. He's starting to make excuses why somebody else would be better to go. And then finally, verse 13, but he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. You could see where this was going, couldn't you? He finally just says, please send someone else. And then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Clayton Christensen is a brilliant man. He is a professor of business at Harvard University, known primarily for his business theory called disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation. The actual theory is a bit more complicated than it sounds, so I'm going to be pretty simple in terms of how I talk about it here. It really involves those two words. On the one hand, innovation is a great word, right? We love innovation. It doesn't make any difference if you work in the church or in business. We like innovation. It's a good thing. On the other hand, disruption, not so good, especially if the business that is being disrupted is your business. I started thinking about that and about the fact that when you look at the Bible, when you read through the Bible, starting all the way in the Old Testament, all the way through the New, one of the ways in which to think about God is as a disruptive innovator in our lives. For the last year or so, I've been trying to kind of pull out these themes in the Bible that you can see all the way through. I think it's really a powerful way of reading the Bible. If you're reading along something new, or you see something new, and then you start looking for these themes that are all the way through. And this is one of the great themes of the Bible. Whenever God shows up, whenever God speaks, you're going to find disruptive innovation. On the one hand, in Isaiah, God says, I'm doing a new thing. And so we know that's the great news about God. God is constantly doing a new thing, recreating in our midst. But on the other hand, whenever you see God doing a new thing, you see him disrupting somebody's life, or disrupting an entire culture or an entire society. Let me just give you a few examples. We'll run through the Bible here real quickly. God shows up out there with Abraham and Sarah, the very first real story in the Bible, and he uproots them. He says, look, I want you to go on a journey. He sends them to places they never dreamed of. Then we see it here in Moses. He finds Moses out there in the pasture in the meadow in Midian. We said this last week. I think Moses had kind of checked out of life. He was enjoying the solitude and the silence. God says, I'm sending you back to Egypt. We see it in the lives of the prophets in the Old Testament. And when God comes to the prophets, he not only disrupts the lives of the prophets, but of the entire society around them. You thumb over to the New Testament, look at how God speaks through the angels in Matthew and in Luke to Mary and to Joseph. Their lives suddenly disrupted because of God doing a new thing. In the life of Jesus, as Jesus walks along the Sea of Galilee, walks into the lives of so many people, all of a sudden everything changes. And then the disciples, Peter and Paul, the others. God is the great disruptor in our lives. Whenever God speaks, something's going to change. A number of years ago, I decided that I was going to be able to teach myself how to play golf. I became obsessed by the notion that I could somehow teach myself how to be a decent golfer. In retrospect, it really wasn't a notion, it was a delusion. I tried playing golf for a number of years. I was obsessed about it. I finally was getting worse rather than better, so I gave up the game. But right in the middle of my obsession, like all of you who are golfers, I was interested in the equipment, and I decided that I needed a new golf bag. And so I remember doing this. This isn't that many years ago, but I will date myself. I was looking in the want ads of the Dallas Morning News. When was the last time you did that, Want ads of the Dallas Morning News, and I found an ad by a man living here in Plano who had a used golf bag for sale, and it sounded like what I wanted. So I called him up. We made a date. I went over to his house. It was out in the garage. And we dickered a little bit, and I bought the golf bag. I think it's still out in my garage. If any of you want it, I'll just give it to you. But it's interesting. He and I started talking with one another. He's a great guy, and we became friendly. And when he found out that I was a pastor, he said, man, there's a story I've got to tell you. He grew up, he's a bit older than I, but grew up in the old Cliff Temple Baptist Church in Oak Cliff, downtown Dallas. Those of you who grew up in Dallas, remember, it was one of the great Baptist churches, Cliff Temple. This is back in the 50s. His father was the director of music there. And he said, I remember, and he was just a child, so you know how powerful this story was for him. He said, I was in church one Sunday night, and the head deacon, Mr. E.B. Moore, got up to pray. And Mr. Moore was tall and elegant, gray-headed, and a baritone voice. And he said, we all knew that when Mr. Moore got up to pray, you might as well sit back and just kind of get settled in for a while because you were going to be there for a while. Some of you aren't old enough to know this, but back then, a Baptist deacon could pray longer than a Methodist preacher could preach. So Mr. Moore started praying, and he went for about 5 minutes with just kind of the introductory stuff. Dear God, here we are, those kinds of things. But after about 5 minutes, he launched into a prayer of great concern about a homeless family that was living under the viaduct by the Trinity River. And my friend said, he literally went on for about 5 minutes talking about this family, about the fact that something needs to be done about this family. They need some help, reaching out for divine guidance. And then he said, all of a sudden, he went silent. Totally silent, not a word. And they sat there in the pews. They listened for 30 seconds, a minute and a half went by, 2 minutes. He said at 2.5 minutes, people started, looking up because they were afraid that maybe something had happened to him, maybe a stroke or heart attack. He said, I looked up and there was Mr. Moore gripped to the pulpit, tall, erect, a little pale. And he said there was sweat on his brow. And after about 4 minutes of silence, this is what he said. "Never mind, Lord. I'll take care of that situation myself." That's a great story, isn't it? When God speaks to us, usually things are going to change, and God's going to disrupt our lives, give us a little job to do. Well, that's exactly what happened out there in the plain of Midian. When Moses was out there, he had this wonderful private moment, the burning bush moment. God appears to him, and Moses is thrilled with that moment, perhaps somewhat afraid. But he doesn't anticipate that God is about to give him a job. And basically, this is what God says to Moses. "Moses, whether you like it or not, you are a part of my great salvation story." By the way, that's one of the great ways, another theme, one of the great ways to read the Bible. God's great salvation story. He says, "Moses, you have an important role to play in my great salvation story, and I'm calling you to it today. Your brothers and sisters are still back in Egypt. You may be having a good time here on the plain of Midian, checked out from life, but your brothers and sisters are still in Egypt. And here's what I've got to say to you. When one Hebrew is a slave, you are a slave. When one Hebrew is in pain, you are in pain." He calls Moses to go back to Egypt to begin the epic story we're all familiar with of leading God's people to the Holy Land. That's what happens when God speaks, isn't it? Our lives become disrupted. You know, we didn't plan it this way, but Pat and I both, as we started moving in our preparation towards this day, it occurred to me, it occurred to Pat, of course, this wonderful music today. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, Martin Luther King Jr. And I spent some time thinking about those days of civil rights when we were led as a society by the prophetic words of Martin Luther King Jr. And I remembered Rosa Parks. You know, there came this moment when Rosa Parks refused to stand up and give her seat to a white person on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And we didn't know it at the time, but looking back, you understand what that was, don't you? That was a burning bush moment. That was a burning bush moment. We didn't get it at the time, but in that moment when Rosa Parks refused to give her seat, God was saying, Jim Crow in the South is over. It's finished. It's done. It took a while. It took a while. And God knows we've still got work to do, but it was a burning bush moment where God disrupted things for the better. And then Martin Luther King Jr., I think if you go back and you look at the power of Martin Luther King's speeches and his sermons especially, what you will discover is that in the eyes of Martin Luther King and his own imagination, the whole civil rights movement was animated by this story. It was the story of Moses. It was the story of God's people moving through the Red Sea parting, God's people moving from slavery to freedom, to dignity. And you go back and you listen to the music. It is the Moses story. And so we understand that. If we decide to go on that journey of faith and listen to God, we know inevitably that God's going to do a new thing in our lives. But God's also going to disrupt our lives. Let me tell you something that's really unique about the story of Moses in the Bible. It is unlike any other story because it is really the only epic saga we have. We have the 33 years of Jesus, of course, and we have snippets out of the lives of other great leaders and saints, the King David and some of the prophets and so forth. But Moses is the only one that is this epic saga. No wonder they've made so many movies about him. Because we see there Moses as a baby in the little reed basket floating in the Nile. We see him go to Midian. We see God call him back to Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. And when you follow the whole story, guess what you get? Great moments of triumph and victory. The burning bush, the parting of the Red Sea. And you get great moments of defeat and sadness. The people were rebelling against Moses, saying, "Take us back to Egypt, at least we had food to eat there." Whose life does that sound like to you? I don't know, maybe you haven't lived long enough, but to me that sounds like my life and your life. An ordinary life full of victory and joy and full of grief and disappointments and pain. It is a great, epic story that when we look at the whole of it, it tells us what it means to live a life of faith. And so this morning, let me just finish up this morning by asking 3 questions. If you're thinking about beginning a life of faith, or if you're wanting to go deeper in your life of faith, I think these 3 questions that grow out of the Moses story are extremely relevant. The first one is this. We've been talking about it all morning. Are you willing to have your life disrupted? Because inevitably, if you listen for the voice of God, that's what's going to happen. And I say that because there are a lot of religious expressions these days that don't really count that part in. There are some religious expressions that are pretty much private. Now look, a lot of you know this. I'm a dedicated meditator. I meditate every morning. It's important to me. But if your meditation or your yoga or whatever it is that you do, if it does not move you beyond a private moment, it's not really faithful. There is no such thing as private religion. And so if you decide to go deeper in your faith by listening for God, you just already know that God's going to say, "Get up, go." As long as someone is not free, you are not free. As long as someone is in pain, you are in pain. As long as my kingdom in heaven has not become my kingdom on earth, there's work for you to do. Your life will be disrupted. There's a second question. This is the tough one. Are you willing to trust God more than you trust yourself? I'll just have to say to you this morning in all honesty, that the reason I'm not further along in my own spiritual journey is that most of the time my answer to that question is no. I have this wrestling match with God all the time. God, why would I trust you? I'd rather trust myself. I'd rather be in control of my own life. That's just the honest truth. And much of the time it takes more courage and more faith than I have to be willing to reach out and say, "Okay, God, starting now, I'm going to trust you more than I trust myself." And then this last question. Are you willing to live dangerously? Are you willing to live dangerously? C.S. Lewis was a great man. A lot of you know C.S. Lewis. He was an Oxford-educated, brilliant, British intellectual, a dedicated atheist for the first half of his life. He and the great J.R. Tolkien were best friends. Somebody sent me, I don't know who it was that sent this to me the other day. It was an article about the friendship of J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Tolkien, the great Christian, Lewis, the great atheist. But how they were, this friendship, this conversation they had ongoing for years. They would sit around drinking scotch and smoking their pipes, Tolkien witnessing to him about the Christian faith until the day came that Lewis gave his life to Christ. And he became fully committed with his heart and also with his mind. This great intellect who was convinced there was not a God finally became convinced both in his mind and in his heart and his spirit that there is a God. And so he spent the last half of his life writing books, defending the faith, and trying to convince other people to become Christians. C.S. Lewis once wrote a book that I think everybody should own. I don't think I've ever told a whole congregation, you need to buy this book. Well, I did tell you to buy my book, I think, but he had a series of children's books called The Chronicles of Narnia. Now you need to know, C.S. Lewis was very clear about this. He said there's no such thing as children's literature. Because if it's good enough to write for children, it's good enough for an adult to read. And so the first book in that, The Witch, the Lion, and the Wardrobe, it's just about 90 pages, and you can read it at one sitting. And if you don't have it, you need to go get it. I'll make sure they're in the library. Sit down and read it to your grandchild or your child. That way you'll read it. Or just sit down and read it yourself. There's this one great moment where the three children are with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And Mrs. Beaver announces, she says, I hear that the lion is on the move. Aslan, the lion, is the Christ figure in this story. She said, I hear that the lion is on the move. And Lucy says, the lion, I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with a lion. Is he safe? And Mr. Beaver says, oh no, he's not safe, but he's good. He's good. When God speaks, God is going to disrupt your life. God is going to do a new thing in your life. God is going to call you to live dangerously. There we see Moses out there in the middle of nowhere, and suddenly God speaks to him. And Moses decides to go, to follow. Will you?